Hello everyone, how are you? I'm Mari Thurger and today I'm going to talk about Loki, the fire god. Is he really a fire god? Is he even a god? Well, 3 years ago or so, one of my very first videos was about Loki actually, where I've made a claim that he's a figure from Norse mythology related to fire. Also, in a very recent video about misconceptions in Old Norse religion, I've also stated that Loki wasn't a god, so there might have been a few misunderstandings on that one. What I meant was that Loki was never worshipped and doesn't appear outside written sources in Scandinavia, and seems to be solely a character from literary works. However, there might have been folk traditions and folk beliefs towards a spirit that may be the origins of the later Loki that appears in written sources. Or in folk beliefs and customs, some evidences concerning Loki and his origins may have been kept. Perhaps the first question here is, what makes a god a god? Now, putting aside more exoteric explanations and philosophical religious ideas on the conception of the divine, in an historical and obviously archaeological sense, what makes a god, a divinity, is precisely human expression of devotion, worship, veneration, some ritualistic act towards a supernatural entity. In other words, a deity is an entity the human being shows some interaction towards it, with material culture towards it. So it clearly shows us a physical interaction with a supernatural entity. However, as you well know, the supernatural panorama in Old Norse system of beliefs wasn't just about the divine, wasn't just about the gods and goddesses. In fact, there seems to have been a lot more religious and ritualistic expressions towards a variety of entities that were not considered gods, but rather spirits of the land, spirits of a place, of a waterfall, rivers, forests, a particular stone with a weird shape, and so on and so forth. The gods played a minor role in the daily lives of pre-Christian ordinary Scandinavian people when it comes to performances of magic and ritual, and an actual physical interaction and action towards the spiritual. So what makes a god for pre-Christian Scandinavian standards was having a physical place of worship towards that divine entity. And it is divine because it doesn't enter in the supernatural panorama or category of spirits to whom the individual human being can have a direct contact with, but rather the divine belongs to the group of entities, supernatural entities, further away from the physical human community, the domestic environment, representing a wider conception of power existing in a broader panorama, with specific attributes, qualities, and most importantly, with a specific role to play, a specific function. A deity is an entity whose power has a more general extension, and the human being worships that deity when the human being is in need of the specific power of the deity over a specific function. For instance, an example, a god of fertility would preside over fertility aspects, which is its function, its purpose, its power, and so won't be called upon for other functions outside the scope of fertility, right? Well, Loki has nothing of this. No worship to him, no place names derived from him, but we shall see this further ahead. And he doesn't play a specific role. It isn't clear his function and purpose. But we shall see all of this throughout this video, don't worry. Even if Loki isn't an actual god, there is more we can say about him than most of the other actual gods that were actually worshipped. And this is what makes Loki so special. The fact that he wasn't worshipped, and yet he appears in almost every written source about the events of the gods. Loki plays a major role in almost everything concerning Old Norse mythological accounts. So, what was so special about him, about Loki, to make so many written accounts either about this figure or including it in the tales of the gods? So, what I'm going to do today will be trying to answer two main questions. Is Loki a god? And is he even related to fire? So, I'm going to start with the case of Loki's divinity or lack of it, and finally I shall explore this fire quality or connection to fire expressed in the figure of Loki, and perhaps even this his aspect of god of mischief and trickery. And speaking of mischief, there's something I want to show you before we proceed. Well, I have something to show you. It's a surprise. I mean, it probably isn't by now. I believe this video came out in August 2020, and you are watching this from that moment onwards, of course. But I have recorded this video 2 months ago, so it's pretty new to me. So speaking of mischief and trickery, what better animal to represent such a thing? Cats. So, by the time I have recorded this, it has just been 3 days after I adopted these two stray kittens, two little girls. They are so named Gigi and Soul. The smallest being is Gigi. And if you have been here since my very first year here on YouTube, you probably remember Mr. Tico, my cat, who was my greatest friend and companion for 17 years. And sadly, he was only around the first year of YouTube and died soon after. He passed away, unfortunately. And I felt it was time to give home to other kittens in the same conditions, abandoned or born in the streets. So I have adopted Soul and Gigi. And remember, my dear friends, there's a lot of animals in great need of shelter and a loving home. So adopt one. Now, go on, little ones. Now, let's start our today's video. So here we go. Gods, this is amazing. Bloody menace. When we read about Old Norse mythological accounts, the first thing we immediately notice is that the stories about Loki and references to this entity are greater in number than all the other gods, perhaps second in number only to the accounts told about Odin and Thor. And even in such accounts, Loki is also present in the great majority of events, as being the companion of Odin and Thor in many adventures. He is a central character in many important events, such as the rebuilding of Asgard's walls, the birth of Sleipnir, the acquisition of the most important treasures and powers the gods desperately want to get their hands on, the death of Balder, of course, the event of Ragnarok, etc. Perhaps we can divide the accounts where Loki enters in three main categories. Accounts where Loki is the cause of disorder, where Loki restores order, and where Loki plays a neutral role. The interesting idea expressed by the presence of Loki in the events of the gods is that, be he the cause of disorder or the key element restoring order, Loki always has an action, comes up with a solution, and his final role is the result of action and put into practice the solution. Loki always starts and ends the events. He seems to play the role of change, actually. In the orderly world of the gods, in the stagnated, timeless sphere of order, Loki is the force of change, forcibly causing change through an action. And such an action is neither good nor evil, but it's just an impulse, a chaotic event that forcibly turns upside down completely the state of order. Everything is revolved and spins around. And Loki will present a solution to restore the order. However, that order isn't the same as before, because from the moment Loki interacts and interferes with the lives of the gods, everything changes and is never the same again. An order is restored. Until that order turns into a stagnated existence, the order becomes obsolete and Loki forces a change again to settle a new order. And then, of course, there are the accounts where Loki plays a neutral role, but he is always the companion of some deity, usually Odin and or Thor. And even so, his actions provoke change, and there are solutions, and the accounts where Loki appears as a neutral figure always give some insight, some wisdom, and it's also done with humor. Even in the tragic event of the death of Balder, provoked by Loki, the right conditions for the survival of the cosmos after Ragnarok are created with the death of Balder. The death of Balder is a great tragedy to the gods, there's no mistake, but with his death, Balder is actually protected from the ultimate destruction of the cycle of all things, and he is able to return, to reborn and be the light after darkness, the new order after the end of a cycle and beginning of a new one. So, who is Loki? Even though Loki's functions and role in the myths isn't clear, it isn't well defined like the other gods, he still plays the major role in most of the events. He is a major character. As I said, there is no actual Loki outside the Old Norse written sources and Scandinavian folk tales. There may be some representations of him in bracteates outside Scandinavia from late Iron Age continental Germanic cultural reality, but those are just assumptions. Of course, I may explore that on another video actually, but it's not likely that those are a representation, a clear representation of Loki. Certainly not the deity we know by the name of Loki. Also, we see Loki in English Christian monuments, but those are clearly picking up several motifs from Norse mythology, often related to Ragnarok, precisely to equate with the Christian apocalypse and make a clever syncretism of religious motifs to reinforce Christian religious conceptions. Such is the case of the Gosforth cross. Please do read the notes below. I'm sure they are quite long, but it saves a lot of time for both of us. And if you can, also watch my video on Vidar, which I shall put right here. So you can have a better idea of what I just said concerning the representations of Loki outside written sources of Scandinavia, especially the case of the Gosforth cross. But Loki clearly plays an active role and appears as often as Odin, and certainly more often than most gods. So he might have been a god in the past, an actual god, just not with that name, Loki. Well, this is just one idea, but I've said this before. There is this tiny possibility that Loki might be an abbreviation of Lodor, since Lodor is one of the three gods involved in the creation of humanity. One of the gods that gifts humans with spirit and abilities. And Loki is often the companion of Odin and Thor, making a sort of very weird and dangerous trinity. But the religious conceptions of three gods is present in many Proto-Indo-European and, of course, Indo-European mythologies. That's very recurrent, and it's not even certain that the name Lodur refers in fact to Loki. I mean, there have been several and unsuccessful attempts to identify Loki with the mysterious Lothor, who is said to have taken part in the creation of man, of mankind, but of whom little is known. The most probable scenario here is that there was an actual god with some other name, probably not even close to the name Loki, or maybe similar, and a god with an actual function, maybe highly worshipped, or at least quite famous in folk traditions and oral traditions and ritualistic folk practices, enough to be kept in the sources, in the written sources, but with another name, as Loki. But more probable than this is that Loki is the product of several accounts, earlier accounts, that mentioned a variety of entities, and Loki was created later on to unite a variety of characters into one, as a form of creating a unique character that links everything together. This character that represents the unification of earlier several folk tales and oral traditions and possibly even lost mythological accounts gained that name, Loki, derived from the Old Norse verb loka, which means to lock or to shut, to bind or to close. And I think it is important to make a reflection on this, because the Norse myths, before being put to parchment, were already too sparse and confusing. The written sources that have survived are already the product of cultural syncretism, of thousands of years of accounts having been told and retold countless times and reshaped according to several cultural changes. And if you notice in the written sources, Old Norse written sources, Loki is always the one linking events, not particularly being a figure representative of good or evil, but doing both or being neutral, simply acting and causing something that changes everything. And he is always the one that makes the stories go on and linking events together and comes up with problems and solutions, and it carries on the story. He binds, he connects. So it's quite possible that Loki was created for that purpose, precisely as a literary phenomenon to link the confusing fragments of Norse myths and creating a coherent story from start to finish. So it was a sort of literary play of words, Loki with the Old Norse verb loka, to bind or to close. But then again, this may also indicate that the actual deity or deities or several entities in question that gave rise later on to Loki had already been forgotten by the Viking period. The name of, or the names, had already vanished from living memory, and so they gave him that name, Loki, to remember this forgotten entity or entity's condition as being binders. He may have been a powerful spirit, actually, as we shall see further ahead. He may not be a god, but may have been a spirit, a powerful spirit, under another name or no name at all that we know of, as we find the verb loka in vard lokur, precisely, for instance, which is to bind the spirits, the song to bind the spirits, to close in the spirits. Vard lokur gave origins to the Scots word warlock, which by itself is a magical performance dealing with knots, and to bind spirits in knots, in an actual thread, as the physical tool to bind the spirits in knots, to retain the spirits. So Loki might have been a spirit whose function was to bind, but on Vardlok or some other time. The important aspect here is that the name Loki in itself already means to lock or bind or connect or to close, but also to end or create a conclusion. So we are not in the presence of a god, but a literary character whose name is Loki, precisely to create a character to bind accounts together. As I said, by the time the written sources were committed to parchment, much had already been forgotten, and a lot has been changed over time and told and retold countless times. So, and let's not forget that there wasn't a coherent story of the gods, a unique story with a beginning and an end. It was Sturluson in the 13th century, plain Catholic period of Iceland, that tried to create a coherent mythology, linking it all together by picking up several fragments and adding to the accounts several religious ideas of his own time, several biblical accounts, and a lot of influence, of course, from classical myths as well. He was filling in the gaps. Let's also not forget oral tradition and transmission of the accounts, and the way that transmission was done must also be taken into consideration. Several versions of the same tales, the same accounts, but with different details, were circulating at the same time. When finally put to parchment, we have to also consider the copy errors, mistranslations, the biases over the centuries, as well as the deliberate distortions and suppressions of the accounts. There are hundreds of contradictions in the Old Norse written sources concerning mythological accounts for all these reasons and all the doings of the gods. And this is probably why Loki came in as a character binding it all together, filling in the gaps, creating connections, creating a conclusion. This may also be the reason why Loki is an entity without a specific function. And just like the very mythological accounts themselves, Loki is a character filled with contradictions. Because his function was a literary function only, to connect it all together. But this is just one idea, as I've said. Now, returning to Lothar, unfortunately, we know nothing about Lothar. Only that one account in which he is present in giving humans attributes and waking up life in humanity. Loki might be Lothar. As I said, it can even be an abbreviation of the name to make it easy to understand and to read and to make a meaning. But the strong meaning behind the Old Norse verb loka, which is to shut and to bind and to lock, which is related to Loki, tells it otherwise. There is often this attempt to link Loki to other entities that have a similar name, such as Loegi, the fire spirit, the personification of fire. However, Loegi, as being the fire spirit, might be indeed related to Loki as he himself being the fire spirit, but we shall get to that. But pay close attention to this. It's not a question of linguistics, but a question of similarities in the sound and the words, purposely included in mythology to create sense and meaning. It's very probable that Loki isn't just a literary phenomenon after all, and a play of words to bind things together, but a far more clever idea, including a famous and beloved spirit in the main mythological accounts to bind people together, and at the same time creating a name, Loki, precisely with the function of also binding sparse, disorganized, and confusing accounts. It is of my belief that Loki may indeed have been a spirit, not a god, but a spirit, with its name changed precisely to bind the accounts together. But the amount of action and interaction of Loki in the sources, in the written sources, may be indeed in reference to an actual spiritual entity from pre-Christian Scandinavian folk system of beliefs. As I said before, supernatural entities of place and of the elements and of the domestic environment were far more present in the daily lives of Old Norse ordinary people than the gods ever were. I have a video precisely about that, and I urge you to watch it if you can, obviously, right here on this right upper corner. So, there may have been a spirit, a fire spirit, spirit of the hearth and the domestic environment, to whom people had a greater interaction towards through ritual and magical folk practices and folk customs in their private environment, domestic environment, every day. And as such, there were countless accounts in oral tradition and folklore about this spirit surviving in the written sources as Loki, giving this name precisely to bind things together, bind all the accounts, the earlier accounts, and connect all the accounts. So perhaps all the activities performed by the character Loki are from folk tales and oral traditions of a fire spirit, an archaic religious conception surviving in myths and in folk tales. But don't worry, I shall develop this further ahead precisely about this fire spirit. Continue to speak of Loki, if he is a god or not. There are other things to take into consideration, so let's develop this. Yes, I'm afraid until now it was a sort of introduction. I don't know how long we will be in here, but I think I'm about to make my longest video ever. We shall see. Now, Loki has long been seen as a problem by historians of religion and by archaeologists as well, because in religious terms, he isn't actually a god of anything specifically. And in archaeological terms, he isn't found anywhere, not even on place names that denote the presence of the worship of a specific deity in that place, or objects or anything really that include his name, Loki. Theophoric. That's the fancy term for something bearing the name of a god. Now, Loki has no obvious function. There are no evidences for a cult associated with him. The place of Loki in the circle or in the world of the gods isn't clearly defined, although he is a prominent figure and plays an important part in most of the well-known myths. Perhaps we can divide certainly the tales in which Loki enters in two main and distinct written sources: the prose Edda and the poetic Edda, of course. If we read Snorri's accounts on Loki, prose Edda, this character is the most outstanding figure among the northern gods, the chief personality, as the moving force in a large number of plots. If you notice the accounts involving other gods, they are accounts very serious, macabre even, and harsh, and filled with references to rites of passages and initiations and rituals in a more profound sense of the interactions between humanity and the supernatural. And Loki, on the other hand, is the only character that brings humor, comedy into the realm of the gods, but also tragedy. By Snorri's hands, Loki is a sort of mixture between the classical hero Odysseus, but also has a lot of elements similar to the Christian devil. But in its essence, filtering out classical and Judeo-Christian influences in Snorri's work, the Prose Edda, Loki plays a role of an adventurous hero. Loki is less related to the ritualistic and magical performances of pre-Christian system of beliefs and more related to humanity and emotions felt by human beings. This, of course, in Snorri's account, the Prose Edda. On the other hand, if we read the poems, the Poetic Edda, Loki is a vaguer figure, much more powerful and sinister. And it's in the poems that we get closer to an understanding of Loki, perhaps, in these accounts that have inspired Snorri Sturluson later on. He is without a doubt an ambivalent character, neither altogether good nor bad. But it's in Snorri's accounts that the bad side of Loki predominates. Snorri wasn't just influenced by Judeo-Christian beliefs and superstitions and classical myths, but also from, obviously, Old Norse early written sources. It seems that by the late Viking age, Viking period, the more wicked and dangerous side of Loki was much more augmented, a greater emphasis on the more negative aspects of this character, and indeed creating a comparison with the Christian devil. Loki appears in Snorri's accounts to have been directly responsible for the death of Balder, a solar deity. But outside the Prose Edda, the evidences are slender, and the picture of him as Balder's murderer is a late development due to the gradual blackening of his reputation. I have an older video about this precisely, which by now I should probably remake with more detail, but I'll leave down below in the description. But I have spoken about this before, as Loki progressively becoming the characterization of the Christian consciousness towards the perception of evil. And his seemingly evil aspects start to completely overshadow all his other attributes as Christianity progressively develops in the north. And it comes to the point that Loki, in the Ragnarok account, is turned into the spitting image of the devil in Christian myths of the apocalypse. Even his fight against Heimdallr, as Heimdallr becomes this champion of Hallsgard, champion of heavens, quite similar to the Archangel Michael, also a champion of heavens, and the Archangel fights the devil in the apocalypse, just as Loki fights Heimdall in Ragnarok. There's just too many similarities and downright copies of the same conceptions from the late Viking Age onwards. So this is perhaps the most difficult of the many problems connected with Loki, because his entire character becomes equivalent to the Christian devil, to Lucifer, with the advent of Christianity, obviously, in the north. And when Christianity gains considerable religious ground, which was precisely in the moment when the earlier written sources were committed to parchment, by people who were already influenced by the new religion. Anyway, one of the main characteristics of Loki is his sociability. He has adventures with nearly all the inhabitants of the divine sphere, except for Freud, which was one of the most important and highly venerated gods and highly worshipped by the Swedes, and yet it is the only deity Loki doesn't have any interaction with, not directly anyway, which is curious. Loki plays a part in the creation and destruction of the world. He helps in building Asgard. He goes wherever he pleases and is perfectly comfortable among gods, giants, and other entities and beings, which are often in conflict with one another, but Loki is the only one that walks among them all almost freely, showing his neutrality towards the many conflicts among the gods and between the gods and other creatures, other entities. So I think there is no doubt as to his importance in the mythology of Northern Europe. However, it has not been found possible to establish Loki as a major deity. Just because Loki in the myths is always with the gods and constantly interacts with the gods in the written sources only, doesn't make him a god. It's important to remember that mythology is not religion, and there are no evidences of a worship to Loki among Old Norse Scandinavians, or anyone before or after that in Scandinavia, for that matter. Loki is actually a lot more important in contemporary neo-pagan religious manifestations. Loki is a figure solely of mythology and folklore, but that part we shall see further ahead. In the Norse myths, he serves many roles, some of them mutually contradictory, and there have been, of course, several attempts to pick some of his roles and make an interpretation that goes further than what the tales actually demonstrate, trying to make him a god of that role. In many accounts, he is actually depicted as being a trickster character, so this leads people to the assumption that he was a trickster god. But we have to be careful with this. It has to be noted that the Loki in Snorri's tales, Snorri's accounts, is a mischievous being rather than wicked. As far as trickster gods and spirits go in other mythologies, there's always a great deal of wickedness, and Loki isn't particularly wicked, not even in Snorri's accounts. Sometimes his actions cause inconvenience and suffering to the gods, yet on other occasions equal in number compared to the ones he causes something more inconvenient. It is Loki that actually saves the day, rescues the gods from serious circumstances. Sometimes Loki acts under compulsion, mostly because he is pushed too far, either because the giants get him into their power, or the gods become angry and insist that he must put things right for some wrong he has done them. The doings of Loki, in great part, are the actions of a naughty boy rather than crimes against the gods. So, the portrayal of Loki as an evil entity is downright wrong, in my opinion, of course. And Snorri's accounts on Loki have the tendency to push Loki into a character comparable with Lucifer, as he tried to put a great emphasis on the more negative aspects of Loki. I think it's important to remember all of this. I believe that most people come about the Norse myths because, well, they heard it being spoken by others, naturally, or they have seen the Marvel Loki, and they already come with this preconceived idea that he is bad, committing crimes. He is a trickster and wicked being. And that preconceived idea has a great influence on people when they read the actual written sources, and it clouds their judgment and capacity to make an interpretation on what they are reading, because all they will see is the trickery and the crimes instead of what is actually being portrayed. There's no doubt that Loki is portrayed as actually being cunning and ingenious, rather than being a wicked being or a trickster. A trickster which is often synonym to being a liar. Of course, in the late Viking period, as well as into the Catholic period, there's no doubt that Loki progressively became the pagan counterpart to the Christian Lucifer. And from there comes this idea of Loki being a trickster god and evil, in the sense of being a liar and evil. And perhaps worse than that, seen as a fool-like figure serving the gods as a kind of gesture, right? By comparison with other traditions such as the Greek Hermes. But I am not denying this trickster aspect of Loki, mind that. I'm just saying that linking evilness to trickery is a common and wrong impulse. If we take a look at Northern Native American traditions, in the most archaic forms of belief, the trickster figure is at the same time a creator and a destroyer. One that gives and one that takes or denies. One that deludes and he himself is deluded. The trickster spirit of Native Americans is often an entity whose behavior is constrained because its actions are out of impulse, over which he has no control whatsoever. An entity completely unaware of the conceptions of good or evil, yet being responsible for both. An entity without moral, without social restrictions. It obeys to no laws, no rules, completely acting on impulse, out of passion, following the emotion of the moment without measuring consequences, solely to satisfy its needs, and such needs not based on any conscious thought, but purely from emotion. And yet, the actions of the trickster spirit don't come without great values. All these characteristics of the Northern Native American trickster spirit fits perfectly into the various descriptions and actions of Loki. So, in Loki, indeed, we have a far more archaic conception of the trickster spirit, certainly with shamanic roots. In this way, Loki, or whatever was the name of this trickster spirit, is perhaps one of the oldest mythological characters of Northern Europe, pre-Indo-European certainly, belonging to a more archaic collective consciousness of indigenous or native peoples, probably from the Paleolithic. As a matter of fact, the stories about the Native American trickster beings or entities in general show remarkable similarities with the kind of transformative, shape-shifting mischief committed by Loki in the Norse myths cycle. Both Northern American trickster beings and Loki are often harmful, mischievous, shapeshifters, destructive, acting on impulse, obscene, and occasionally evil, but always essential for the continuation of life. They are the force of, or the impulse of change. That's mainly their role. And Loki, indeed, through harmful, obscene, destructive, impulsive, shape-changing, cunning, and devious actions, creates the essential conditions so life may continue to exist and flow and move forward. In this way, Loki isn't particularly solely a Norse god, but in fact a trickster spirit of the subarctic belt. Those are probably his main origins. And for those who say I'm an universalist, as if that was bad, yada yada yada, remember something very, very, very important. Comparative mythologies is a study in the academic field, which is not the same thing as universalism, which is a philosophical and theological concept. Know the difference, please. The history of humanity isn't there for you to like or dislike. It's there so you can learn from it. Some aspects of religion are indeed connected, especially when it comes to animistic, indigenous religious practices and conceptions and beliefs. And I find it extremely curious that, again, Northern American trickster spirits or beings or entities in general are often associated with animals, such as the raven, mink, blue jay, coyote, and so on. And Loki is the progenitor of a number of creatures that will play a significant role in the end of all things, in the change and end of a cycle and beginning of a new one. Of course, obviously, by Christian interpretation, Loki's children became the equivalent to the monsters begotten by Lucifer and the demons of hell. In an attempt to create religious parallels, obviously. However, Loki being the father of Fenrir, a wolf, and the Midgard serpent, well, a serpent, were these two animals at least the embodiment of the trickster animal spirits in Northern Europe? The trickster being or entity has long been seen in contexts of shamanism, even in relation to remote prehistoric periods. So, Loki is a trickster, a deceiver, he is devious, obscene, doesn't play by the rules. Wherever he goes, he creates mischief, harm, destruction, he creates a scandal. The gods are outraged by his attitudes, yet he also saves the day, saves the gods from a lot of troubles, and presents solutions and gives results. Although sometimes things don't work as he planned. Loki is the figure that moves forward and always gives himself to others. He often plays the role of being punished for the deeds of others and acts on behalf of others because they might be too ashamed to act or too proud. And it's Loki that also suffers the consequences of others' actions. When there is trouble in the world of the gods, it's Loki that moves forward to deal with trouble, or being the companion of the brave god that tried to face trouble, and Loki is always there to support. Despite all the things Loki does, being completely immoral and acting on impulse, the gods allow him among them. He is allowed anywhere. He has no particular function. He is chaotic in nature, but he is necessary. And this strong aspect of his character resembles indeed the trickster, who plays a great part in the myth and folklore of a number of northern Native American tribes. In Northern American native folklore and mythology, the trickster supernatural entity is greedy, selfish, and treacherous as well. He takes on animal form, he appears on comic and often disgusting situations, and yet he may be regarded as a kind of cultural hero who provides mankind with benefits like sunlight and fire. At times, he even appears as a creator. The trickster being can take on both male and female form and can give birth to children, just like Loki precisely, taking on both male and female forms and bearing children. Remember when he shapeshifts into a mare and gives birth to the eight-legged stallion Sleipnir. The trickster entity in Northern American native folklore and mythology is in fact a kind of semi-comic shaman, halfway between god and hero. Indeed, that's what Loki seems to be, the representation of the shaman, the very person who doesn't play by the rules or laws of the society, often shunned, outlawed, living in the wilds, an outsider, not fully understood, and both feared and revered, and devious, obscene at times, with a behavior that is completely immoral and out of every social rule or law or canon, but yet the community needs the shaman. Let's not forget that during the Viking Age, late Viking Age, in terms of ritual behavior, the shaman was seen as something completely foreigner, outlandish. The performers of Seidr, especially men, were labeled effeminate, ergi, horgr. There wasn't a full understanding of their behavior, and the shaman was often seen as something abnormal to the Viking Age social standards. And this sort of mentality fits perfectly into the figure of Loki. Because Loki is always an outsider. He shapeshifts, he changes gender, he is obscene at times, inconvenient, devious, completely immoral, and yet the gods need him and keep him around because of all the benefits he provides to the gods. The trickster from archaic religions, not just Northern American, but also obviously Proto-Indo-European, Asian, and also animistic African myths, is a multifaceted character who undertook the double function of cultural hero and deceiver. Aside from Loki as a parallel entity to this trickster being and all these characteristics and functions, we have the deity Sirdan, a mythological figure of the Caucasian Ossetians, an Iranian ethnic group descendants of the Scythians, to be more precise. Or we also have the giant Amiran or Amirani, the Caucasian Georgian cultural hero, very similar to the classical figure Prometheus, actually. These are all figures that play the cultural hero role. Tricksters, thieves, always ready to give something beneficial to mankind or to take it away, usually related to light, brightness, illumination, and fire. In those aspects, it's actually not that all strange the reason why Loki, in the late Viking period, was equated with Lucifer, as Lucifer comes from Latin lux ferro, bringer of light. And indeed, the entire religious evolution of Lucifer comes way back to an ancient Mesopotamian deity related to the sun and light. We have another particular aspect of Loki, which I'm not going to develop that much in here, not in this video anyway, but as I've previously mentioned, there are parallels between the trickster, Loki, Sirdan, Amiran, and Prometheus as being cult heroes related to theft. So Loki also fits into the perception of the master thief. Thief. Now, it's important to underline that the trickster character of Loki isn't found in his actual tricks. The tricks Loki performs seem to be a later addition to the stories as a form of entertainment. The figure of the trickster was clearly a popular one among storytellers and tended to attract to himself all sorts of folk tales, which is why we have a great amount of accounts on Loki, precisely countless folk tales associated with Loki later on. And so this figure was included in poetry and prose works as a companion of the gods. So Loki, his trickster aspects connecting him to the trickster spirit are found in his behavior, not in the action of doing tricks, but in the behavior and compulsive actions, the harmful and destructive aspects of his character, being devious, not obeying to any laws, no morals, purely driven by passion and by emotions. That's what makes him a trickster spirit and not the tricks he performs. His strong personality and impulsive acts, always defying the gods, just like the trickster being and the other gods previously mentioned, always cultural heroes. This cultural hero figure, defying the gods somehow and being punished, at least in the end, often bound and tortured, precisely like Loki, bound and having poison slowly dripping into his face and hurting him. But like I said, the actual tricks in Loki's tales seem to be later inventions purely for entertainment. However, Loki also has another chief characteristic, as I was saying, that likely points out to earlier myths of Indo-European origin. So after he was regarded as a trickster spirit and before he became the Viking Age Loki we know of. One of his chief characteristics is being a thief, or his great talent as a thief. In the sources, again and again, he steals or hides the treasures of the gods, the apples of youth, or the belt and gloves of Thor, and the necklace of Freya, and so on and so forth. This side of Loki's character as the master thief can perhaps be traced as far back as to remote antiquity, among the fundamental mythological concepts of the Indo-European peoples. Trickster gods and spirits are often associated with theft, or are patrons or guardians of thieves. And Loki, for instance, has a lot of similarities with Prometheus, as I have said in the notes below. Prometheus, the one who stole the sacred fire and gave it to mortals, another thief. So now, what can we actually say about Loki being related to fire? Let's see. We have already seen that the origins of Loki might have been in the shamanic conceptions of the trickster spirit, or indeed the very representation of the shaman as the cult hero and the figure of the society that doesn't quite belong or fit into the very social panorama and is both feared and revered, but also greatly needed. And later on, with Indo-European influences, this entity gained the attributes of the master thief. So what about fire? I think the element of fire is one of the first things people associate Loki with, but why? Of course, attempts have been made from time to time to see in Loki some link between a fire god, mostly due to the resemblance between the name Loki and the name Loegi, which is fire, the personification of fire, the entity representative of the spirit of fire in Norse myths. In Snorri's tale, or in Snorri's account, when Thor journeys to Utgard with Loki as his companion, they take part on a series of contests set out by the chieftain of the giants, Utgarda Loki, literally the Loki of Utgard, another trickster figure closely related to magic and sorcery, which are other attributes of the Seder performer. There is an eating contest between Loki and Loegi, the fire spirit. It's true that Loki doesn't behave like a fire spirit, and even though Loki resembles other deities linked to light and fire, he isn't particularly surrounded by events concerning the element of fire. More often than not, Loki is actually related to water and air. Loegi is the personification of fire, and it's curious to see the similarities between its name and that of Loki, and the two of them put together in a contest in which the fire spirit wins. In linguistic terms, we could argue that the letter G in Loegi could hardly fit into the K of Loki, or also the German word Lohe, which is blaze, flame, big flame, isn't from the same root as Loki, obviously. But this is a mythological account. It hardly has to do with linguistics. It's not a question of etymological relation. It's not a question of evolution of language. It's actually a play of words. That's how mythology works. The fact that Loki and Loegi are put together, and the similarities of the names, or the sound of the names and how they are written, is indeed on purpose, a play of words, to create an easy connection, to create meaning in mythological accounts. Association of contexts through the similarities of sound and the meaning behind the words. It's a question of creating meaning and association and identification. Mythology works like that, creating meaning through association and similarities. Those are important factors to take into consideration. Loegi and Loki together in mythology is indeed to create association and meaning through the similarities of the names. For instance, in Norway, Loki is linked with the kitchen fire, and when the fire in the stove crackles, people say Loki is beating his children. Also, leftovers are thrown into the fire for this Loki. This is still quite present in Norwegian folklore. Loki associated with fire. Why is that? If we take a look at very late medieval period of Scandinavian material concerning folklore and well into the late Middle Ages and actually in modern period in great part, it seems that there were two Loki. One was a spirit, the so-called Vette, a domestic spirit living under or by the fireplace, helping farmers with the farm work and attracting wealth to the farm. The other Loki is the one we know, the mythical character whose characteristics not only fit into the figure of the trickster spirit, as previously spoken, but also quite similar to the domestic fire Loki of the fireplace. And many of Loki's myths, especially in later traditions, allude to the domestic spirit Loki. As I said before, Loki is the fusion of possibly hundreds of different earlier accounts, and as I have pointed out, the trickster's figure in whichever culture always tends to attract to himself all sorts of folk tales. It's a popular entity, So no doubt that Loki, as a trickster spirit, attracted many of the folk tales about the Loki of the fireplace and vice versa. Loki of the hearth, the Vette, the domestic spirit. Now, between the 17th and the 20th centuries, we have a wondrous variety of folk traditions concerning a Loki as a domestic spirit. In Denmark and southern Sweden, for instance, when heat hazes are observable, you know, when it's too hot and you can see the heat waves, especially when these are observable above newly plowed fields in springtime, people attribute this to the flock of Loki. Loki driving his flock. In southern Swedish folklore, Loki helped the farmers harrow the fields in springtime. Another example, as I have already pointed out previously, in many parts of Sweden and also Norway, people attributed, until quite late, the crackling or whistling of a fire or a sudden flare of a fire, of the flame from the embers, or the blowing of ash. They associated this to the spirit Loki, as in he was blowing on the ashes or on the fire or on the embers, or spanking his children, causing them to scream, which is the crackling and whistling of the fire. This also indicates Loki as a spirit of the air, blowing the fire, blowing on the ashes and on the embers, and being related to the undulations of heat. In certain parts of Scandinavia, mostly rural areas, small sacrifices of food or gifts of food, leftovers mostly, were made to the Vetten of the fire, to the spirits of the fire. And in most cases within late folklore, the actual spirit was Loki. It's curious because this is related to a common custom throughout southeastern Sweden and the Swedish-speaking areas east of the Baltic. The custom of throwing milk teeth into the fire during the recitation of a rhyme that addresses Loki or Luko or Luki and Nok. All names derive from the Old Norse Loki, as I have placed on the previous note, I hope. But also this similarity in sound to create meaning through similarity, just like with Loegi, the personification of fire, the flame. And the rhyme goes like this. Loki, Loki, give me a gold tooth. Here you have a gold tooth. This is interesting because, well, obviously, a milk tooth isn't of gold, but you are trying to trick the fire spirit or the fireplace spirit Loki into giving him a gold tooth in exchange for an actual gold tooth. You see, the trickster aspect of Loki, deception and illusion, trying to trick the very trickster spirit of fire or of the fireplace, Loki. But not only that, but remember, in the majority of the myths about Loki, the Old Norse character, he provides the gods with priceless treasures from the other world. Thus, he is one of the most beneficial of the gods, actually. So in this folk custom of throwing a milk tooth into the fire to receive a golden tooth, you are expecting to receive a priceless treasure from Loki, the spirit of domestic fire or of the fireplace. So, in many folk traditions throughout Scandinavia, from the late Middle Ages and throughout the modern age and also obviously contemporary times, we have this Loki as the spirit of the fireplace and also the spirit of heat above the newly plowed fields during the season of spring, and also related to the sound of fire and throwing into the air and the ash because the spirit Loki is blowing into the fire, making it brighter, giving life to it. So the Loki we know of not only is the trickster entity, but also was, maybe, originally a flame or light spirit, because of his connection with the fireplace and heat Eddas, and the etymological identification of Loki with Logi, which is flame, the personification of fire and flame. But it must also be taken into consideration that Loki, as a domestic spirit, lives under or by the fireplace, which is why offerings of food were given to him in the fireplace, which in archaic traditions, the fireplace was the most important part of the house, the central part of the house. This is extremely fascinating to me because it is well known that in traditions revolving around the domestic spirits of the house, one must constantly have interactions with the fireplace, with the spirits of the fireplace, because being the most important place of the house, it also has the most important spirits of the house living in it. Which means if you want to keep your domestic environment in peace and a pleasant place to live in, you need to constantly take care of the domestic spirit of the fireplace. The curious thing about animistic relations with domestic spirits is that the house itself is teeming with spirits. Those who are further away from the fireplace are the ones with fewer powers, usually more angry spirits. And as further away from the house it goes, the spirits become more hostile, unfriendly, because this is a question of animism. The spirits aren't of dead things, but living spiritual entities. And so the closer they are from the fire, from the fireplace, the heat of the house, the happier they are and will provide good things to the owner of the house because they are happy and they have a cozy roof to stay in. So the one living in the fireplace is the spirit that is happier, more powerful. It will take care of your house and yourself. This is attested in a variety of folk traditions from west to east and from north to south. So, offerings to the fireplace spirit are important to keep him pleased and happy, so you can have a harmonious domestic environment. You are feeding the flame. You are feeding the fireplace spirit. And we see this in here precisely with this fireplace spirit called Loki in Scandinavian folk traditions. It's a beneficial domestic spirit, just as the Loki from the Old Norse myths, who was a dweller of Asgard, the home of the gods, the domestic environment of the gods, and the provider of beneficial treasures to the gods. The gods kept Loki around because he provided good things. Just the same way the Loki of the fireplace provides good things if you keep him around and happy and feeding the flames. These domestic spirits or household supernatural entities, of course, as you know it, are the same as the Scottish brownies, the hobgoblins as spirits of the hearth, the domovoi of Slavic paganism, kobold in the German folklore, nis and tomte from Scandinavian folklore, trasgu from Portuguese folklore, and so on and so forth. What do they have in common? All of them, what do they have in common? Household spirits related to fire, the candle or the fireplace, and they cause mischief in the house if you do not feed them or take care of them. So if you keep them happy, they bring benefits to your domestic environment. just like the Loki of the fireplace and the Loki of Old Norse mythology. Keep him happy, and he brings good things, but left unattended, he causes mischief. By the end of this video, I'll leave the bibliography so you can explore more for yourself, of course, concerning all of this and concerning Loki and everything that has been said throughout this entire video, including, of course, relations between Loki and fire and air. I think it's very important to take in mind that when studying Old Norse mythology and all those tales about the gods, we must not forget about later material concerning the gods, later written sources concerning the gods, and folktales and oral tradition. These traditions didn't simply cease to exist when Christianity took over. Tales of ancient myths often survive in folklore, and oral tradition, of course, in folklore. There is always a continuation of the stories, especially kept by those in rural areas, in more reclusive and isolated areas. Loki survived as the fireplace spirit, and this isn't something you come up with at a specific moment in time. This relation with fire, or at least the fireplace, must have indeed come from earlier traditions. The Loki in the Norse myths has subtle connections with fire and trickery and theft, etc., but it is in there. And certain elements were carefully picked out of oral traditions and folk tales. So, who is Loki? We can't say he is or ever was a god, but certainly he seems to have his origins in the Trickster entity, a cult hero, the figure of the shaman as an outcast and related to the fireplace as well as a household spirit and the supernatural entity responsible for the behavior of fire and heat. Maybe he isn't a spirit of fire, but at least the spirit that dwells in the fireplace, to whom offerings are given, not actually placed on the fire itself when it comes to food offerings, but on the corners of the fireplace, as we see precisely in the later Scandinavian folk traditions and customs. So his behavior on the fireplace provokes something on the fire, which is why in Scandinavian folk traditions, when fire cracks and sends ash into the air, it is said that Loki is blowing the fire or making it brighter and sending the up ashes and beating his children and when the fire cracks and whistles. Maybe that's why he lost the food contest with Loki, because Loki is the fire itself, but Loki is the spirit that dwells near the main fire of the house. So he lost when it comes to the eating contest. Actually, I forgot to mention that, food offerings to the domestic fire of the domestic spirit of the fireplace, called Loki, were placed in the corners of the fireplace and not directly on the fire. So the spirit consumes the food in the corners. But when the fire is lit or it gets too strong, it will burn those offerings, taking them away from the vete, from the domestic spirit Loki. So perhaps that's why Loki lost the eating contest, because the actual spirit of fire, Loki, rapidly consumes the food and takes the food away from Loki, away from the fireplace vete. And that's why he blows the fire, trying to keep it away, a contest between the two to see which spirit can consume the food offerings. Also, I almost forgot, sorry about that again, we have an interesting myth concerning the birth of Loki, how Loki came to be. Loki's father is Farbauti, meaning fierce strike or fierce striker, as a representation of lightning. And Loki's mother, in the written sources, is either called Null, which means pine needles or related to pine needles. And her other name is, of course, Loki, in relation to leaves or some sort of place filled with foliage, perhaps a tree goddess. Loki was created from the union between lightning and foliage. And if indeed Loki was considered a tree goddess, perhaps what comes out of this union is fire, Loki. As I said, the mother of Loki is also called Nal, meaning needle, in reference to pine needles or maybe fir needles. So lightning with pine needles seem pretty obvious what comes out of it. Could be fire, but could also be ash or smoke, air, in reference to the ash of the fireplace and the Loki of folklore as the fireplace Vette. But pine needles are often used as tinder, dry flammable material used for lighting a fire precisely. It's also curious to notice that the most frequent companion of Thor is Loki, Thor being the personification of lightning, as well as Thor being related to the oak tree. The curious thing about lightning hitting an oak tree is the fact that oak explodes when hit by lightning and throws bits of wood on fire everywhere, like little torches. Perhaps this is, of course, pushing it a little bit too far, but there may be a connection in here. Now, did folklore influence the myths, or did the myths influence folklore? One thing is certain, I think. In folk beliefs and folk traditions between the 17th and the 20th centuries in Scandinavian countries, Loki was considered a spirit of the fireplace, to whom offerings were given, and certain customs that show a clear ritualistic action towards Loki of the hearth as the main household spirit. Now, just to finalize this video, we still have a problem here, of course, the actual worshipping of Loki. Loki is often assumed to have no place names or places or people or objects named after him. So therefore, no historical worship to him. And it is true that among scholars and in the academic field of studies of religion, there is often this tendency to discard worship to a particular deity because nothing is named after that specific deity. I confess, I too often do that. I mean, let's be honest, it's easy that way. If there aren't places named after a deity, then no particular worship was given to that deity. And it isn't far from the truth, actually. When a place is named after a deity, you know that there was a considerable number of people in that area, a big community that had great love and reverence for the deity, and they worshipped that deity. Usually in there we find, in these cult places, we find temples, shrines, some archaeological material culture in reference to the worship of the deity from whom the place takes its name. And this doesn't happen with Loki. So we automatically assume that Loki had no worship. Well, it's true. It seems he had no worship because worship means an expression of reverence and adoration for a deity. And as we have seen, Loki wasn't a deity, wasn't a god, so therefore he wasn't worshipped. But that doesn't mean Loki did not have some sort of magical and ritualistic interaction towards him from the part of human beings. Traditional customs, ritual, folk beliefs, or tradition, some sort of interaction towards Loki as the household helping spirit isn't the same thing as worship of a deity. There was no worship to Loki as a god, but rather folk beliefs towards a spirit. Folk traditions. As we have seen before, Loki fits perfectly into the archaic figure of the trickster, not as a god, but as a trickster spirit, playing the role of cult hero, national hero, the figure of the shaman, a figure halfway between god and hero. Was there worship towards the trickster spirit or the shaman? Not particularly, not as a deity anyway, but there was reverence towards it as a cult hero, a national hero. As I have said before, the figure of the trickster was clearly popular among storytellers of every cultural background and tended to attract to himself all sorts of folk tales because it is considered a national hero. It is famous, it is loved, revered, feared, and all this fame that leads to include him in hundreds of folk tales is precisely because he is loved and famous. He is a popular figure, and this is noticeable in Loki. He isn't a god, but he is in almost every account of the Norse gods. He appears more often than any other deity, perhaps, as I said, second only in number to Odin. And he appears in later folk tales related to fire and the wind, particularly the air that feeds the flame, the spirit of the hearth, the vette of the fireplace. So clearly, there are some accounts about Loki. There are more accounts about Loki than any other deity of the Norse pantheon. And why is that? Because he was considered a national hero, a cult hero, the trickster spirit, very famous, loved, the shaman as a figure halfway between god and hero. So, was Loki worshipped? No, not particularly. But he was famous and loved and revered and feared as well. Was he a god? No, he wasn't. But he fits into the figure of the trickster spirit and a household spirit, either of fire or air or both. Loki the trickster and Loki the vette, the domestic helping spirit. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. Don't go away just yet. By the end of this video, I'll have the bibliography for you so you can check the sources and study this theme for yourself. Again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you can. Put a like on the video and so on and so forth. I'm tired. Sorry. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för det.